I was grilling burgers in my backyard, celebrating my daughter's 16th birthday with about 20 family members, when I saw Margaret storming across the street with her phone pressed to her ear like she was calling in a national emergency. Margaret was our HOA president and the neighborhood's self-appointed fun police. She had that Karen haircut, the attitude to match, and a hobby of making everyone else's life miserable. "Yes, there's a massive illegal gathering happening right now," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "At least 50 people, loud music, complete violation of community standards. You need to send officers immediately." I almost laughed. 50 people? I could count exactly 19 guests, including my elderly grandmother who was sitting quietly in a lawn chair. The loud music was my daughter's Bluetooth speaker playing at barely audible levels. But then Margaret said something that made my blood boil. "I'm calling as HOA president. We have special authority to request immediate police response for community violations." That's when I realized Margaret wasn't just being dramatic. She was impersonating a law enforcement liaison, which was a felony. And she had no idea she was doing it in front of the county sheriff. Let me tell you about Oakwood Heights, our quiet subdivision of 38 houses where Margaret Harrison had been HOA president for 2 years. She'd moved here from some big city, brought her big city attitude, and decided our small-town neighborhood needed her special brand of enforcement. I'd been living here for 8 years, serving as county sheriff for the last 5. Most neighbors knew what I did for work, but Margaret had never bothered to introduce herself or learn anything about the people she claimed to represent. Standing there with my spatula in hand, watching this woman lie to whoever was on the other end of that phone call, I had a choice to make. I could let it slide and avoid drama, or I could teach Margaret about the difference between HOA authority and actual legal authority. I chose option 2. "Margaret," I called out, walking toward the fence that separated our properties. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" She held up one finger like I was interrupting something important. "Yes, I'm still here," she said into the phone. "The homeowner is actually approaching me now. He seems agitated. You might want to prioritize this call." Agitated? I was standing there calmly with a burger spatula, but Margaret was already building her victim narrative. "Margaret, who exactly are you calling?" I asked, keeping my voice level and professional. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly, clearly wanting my guests to hear. "This gathering violates multiple HOA regulations and city noise ordinances." "Which police department?" I pressed. The local police," she said, suddenly less confident. "The ones who handle HOA violations." That's when I knew she was either lying or incredibly misinformed. There's no special police unit that handles HOA violations. Police respond to actual crimes, not neighborhood disputes about party sizes. "Margaret, I need you to hang up that phone right now," I said, and something in my tone made her pause. "Excuse me? You can't tell me what to do. I'm the HOA president. And I'm Sheriff Johnson. Badge number 447. And you just committed impersonation of a law enforcement liaison, which is a Class C felony." The phone slipped from Margaret's hand and clattered on the concrete. Her face went from angry red to pale white in about 3 seconds. "You're what?" "I'm the county sheriff, Margaret. I've lived here for 8 years. And you just claim to have special police authority that doesn't exist while filing a false report about a legal gathering on private property." I watched her brain trying to process this information. The woman who'd spent 2 years throwing around fake authority had just met someone with real authority. I was just, the noise levels. "What noise levels?" "My sound meter app shows 45 decibels. City ordinance allows up to 65 decibels until 10 p.m. It's currently 3:30 in the afternoon." Margaret looked around like she was searching for an escape route. "But the HOA rules clearly state." "HOA rules don't override constitutional rights or city ordinances, Margaret. They also don't give you the authority to impersonate law enforcement, which is exactly what you just did." The birthday party had gone quiet. My guests, my family, even my daughter were watching this confrontation unfold. But I wasn't done with Margaret's education yet. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to call back whoever you just lied to and explain that you made a mistake. Then you're going to apologize to my family for disrupting my daughter's birthday party. And then we're going to have a conversation about the difference between HOA authority and actual legal authority." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For probably the first time in her life, she'd met someone who wouldn't be intimidated by her fake authority. "I don't have to do anything," she finally managed. "I'm the HOA president." "Margaret, you're not understanding the situation. You just committed a crime in front of a law enforcement officer. Your choices are to cooperate with my very reasonable requests, or I can arrest you right now for impersonation and filing a false police report. That's when Margaret made her second mistake of the day. Instead of apologizing and walking away, she doubled down. You can't arrest me. I have rights. I was protecting the community. You absolutely have rights. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly recommend you start exercising. I pulled out my phone and started recording, partly for evidence and partly because I had a feeling this was about to get much more interesting. Margaret's meltdown was spectacular. She started screaming about abuse of power, about how I was using my position to intimidate her, about how she was going to report me to my superiors. Margaret, my superior is the elected county commissioners, and they're very interested in law enforcement officers who use their authority appropriately. What they don't like are people who impersonate law enforcement. I never said I was a police officer. You claim to have special authority to request immediate police response. You stated you were calling as HOA president, like that gave you some kind of official status. That's impersonation of a law enforcement liaison. The neighbors were starting to come out of their houses. Word was spreading quickly that the sheriff was having a very public conversation with the HOA president, and nobody wanted to miss this show. You know what, Margaret? Let me show you how real police authority works. I called dispatch on my radio. This is Sheriff Johnson, badge 447. I'm at 1247 Maple Street responding to a false police report. Requesting a unit for backup and documentation. Margaret's eyes went wide. You can't be serious. I'm always serious about people who think they can abuse emergency services and impersonate law enforcement. Within 10 minutes, 2 patrol units arrived. Officer Martinez and Officer Chin, both officers I'd worked with for years, stepped out of their cars and approached the scene. What's the situation, Sheriff? Officer Martinez asked. We have a resident, I nodded toward Margaret, who called in a false report claiming special HOA authority to request emergency police response. She also appears to have misrepresented the nature of the gathering she was reporting. Officer Chin pulled out his notepad. Ma'am, can you explain what you reported and to which department? Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. I called the police about a noise complaint. Which department specifically? I'm not sure. I just dialed 911. Officer Martinez exchanged a look with me. Ma'am, you called 911 to report a birthday party? It was disturbing the peace. There were too many cars. The music was too loud. I gestured to my backyard, where my family was still gathered around picnic tables with a small Bluetooth speaker playing soft background music. Officers, does this look like a disturbance of the peace to you? Officer Chin walked over to the fence line and looked at the gathering. I count about 20 people, mostly elderly, eating cake. The music is barely audible from here. But the HOA rules? Margaret started. Ma'am, Officer Martinez interrupted. HOA rules are civil matters. They're not criminal violations. Calling 911 for HOA disputes is considered misuse of emergency services. Margaret was starting to realize how deep a hole she'd dug for herself. I didn't know. The problem, Margaret, I said, is that you claim to have special authority. You told the dispatcher you were calling as HOA president, like that gave you some kind of official status. That's where civil dispute became impersonation. Officer Chin finished writing his report. Sheriff, how do you want to handle this? I looked at Margaret, who was now visibly shaking. Part of me wanted to press charges and teach her a lesson she'd never forget. But another part of me remembered that we were neighbors, and I'd have to live next to her for years to come. Margaret, I'm going to give you one opportunity to make this right. You're going to apologize to my family in front of these officers for disrupting my daughter's birthday party with a false police report. Then you're going to call 911 back and apologize to the dispatcher for wasting emergency resources. And finally, you're going to send a letter to every homeowner in this neighborhood explaining that HOA presidents have no special law enforcement authority. Margaret looked like she was about to argue, but Officer Martinez stepped forward. Ma'am, the sheriff is being very generous. Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor. Impersonating a law enforcement liaison is a felony. I'd strongly recommend you accept his offer. The apology was painful to watch. Margaret walked over to my backyard gate, where my entire family was still gathered, and mumbled something that barely qualified as an apology. I'm sorry for calling the police on your party. I made a mistake. My daughter, bless her heart, looked at Margaret and said, It's okay, Mrs. Harrison. Would you like some cake? Even after everything, my 16-year-old daughter was showing more class than the grown woman who tried to ruin her birthday party. Margaret declined the cake and shuffled back to her house, thoroughly defeated. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no, Margaret had learned nothing from this experience. 3 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. Not just my mailbox, every mailbox in the neighborhood. Margaret had written a neighborhood newsletter titled "Abuse of Power: When Law Enforcement Intimidates Citizens." The letter was a masterpiece of victim mentality and selective memory. According to Margaret's version, she'd made a simple noise complaint and been threatened with arrest by a power-hungry sheriff who was using his badge to intimidate concerned citizens. She painted herself as a brave homeowner standing up to corruption, and me as a tyrant who was above the law. The letter concluded with a call for residents to file complaints with the county commissioners about my inappropriate use of law enforcement authority. I sat on my front porch reading this letter, and I had to admire Margaret's commitment to being wrong. Even after being caught in a lie, even after being educated about the law by 3 different officers, she was still convinced she was the victim. That's when I decided Margaret needed a more thorough education about the consequences of her actions. The next morning, I called Margaret and asked her to meet me at the community center. I told her I wanted to discuss her concerns about my conduct in a public forum where other residents could attend. Margaret, still convinced she was the wronged party, eagerly agreed. I spent the rest of the day preparing for what I privately called Margaret's Legal Education Seminar. The community meeting I organized drew 25 residents, which was the largest neighborhood turnout in years. Margaret arrived early, armed with printed copies of her newsletter and a folder full of what she claimed was evidence of my misconduct. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "Mrs. Harrison has raised some serious concerns about law enforcement conduct, and I think it's important that we address these issues publicly." Margaret beamed, thinking I was about to be exposed as corrupt. "Mrs. Harrison, would you like to explain to everyone what happened at my daughter's birthday party?" Margaret launched into her version of events, describing how she'd made a simple noise complaint and been threatened with arrest for exercising her rights as an HOA president. When she finished, I thanked her for her perspective and asked if I could share the actual facts of the case. I pulled out my phone and played the recording I'd made during our confrontation. Margaret's voice filled the room. "I'm calling as HOA president. We have special authority to request immediate police response for community violations." The room went silent. Several neighbors looked shocked. "Mrs. Harrison," I continued, "can you explain to everyone what special authority you were referring to?" Margaret's face flushed red. I meant my authority as HOA president to file complaints. But you specifically claimed authority to request immediate police response. That's not a power HOA presidents have. I pulled out a printed copy of state law regarding impersonation of law enforcement. According to State Statute 13-2907, it's a felony to falsely represent yourself as having law enforcement authority or to claim special powers in dealing with law enforcement. Margaret was starting to look uncomfortable. "I never said I was a police officer." "You're right. You didn't claim to be a police officer. You claimed to have special authority to command police response, which is actually worse." I turned to the assembled neighbors. "How many of you received Mrs. Harrison's newsletter about my supposed abuse of power?" Every hand in the room went up. "And how many of you were concerned that your sheriff might be corrupt?" About half the hands stayed up, which was actually fewer than I'd expected. "I appreciate your concern for accountability in law enforcement. It's exactly the kind of civic engagement our community needs. So let me show you what real police accountability looks like." I pulled out my incident report from the birthday party encounter, complete with witness statements from both responding officers. This is the official report filed by Officer Martinez regarding Mrs. Harrison's 911 call. It documents that she called emergency services to report a massive illegal gathering of 50 people, when there were actually 19 people. It documents that she claimed the music was violating noise ordinances, when sound levels were 20 decibels below the legal limit. I looked directly at Margaret. It also documents that she claimed special HOA authority to request immediate police response, which is a false claim of law enforcement authority. The room was getting uncomfortable. Several neighbors were looking at Margaret with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. "Mrs. Harrison, in your newsletter, you claimed I threatened to arrest you. Can you tell everyone what you were threatened with arrest for?" Margaret mumbled something inaudible. "I'm sorry, can you speak up?" You said I could be arrested for impersonation." "That's correct. Because claiming special law enforcement authority when you don't have it is impersonation of a law enforcement official. It's a felony. I turned back to the neighbors. I gave Mrs. Harrison a choice. She could apologize for filing a false police report and educate herself about the limits of HOA authority, or she could be arrested for impersonation and filing a false report. She chose to apologize. But apparently she didn't learn anything from the experience, because 3 days later she distributed a newsletter accusing me of abuse of power. The room was dead silent. Margaret looked like she wanted to disappear. Mrs. Harrison, do you still believe you have special authority to command police response? No, she whispered. Do you understand that calling 911 for civil HOA disputes is misuse of emergency services? Yes. Do you understand that filing false reports about the nature of gatherings is a crime? Margaret nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to send a correction to your newsletter, explaining that you were wrong about the facts of the case and wrong about HOA authority. You're going to apologize to the emergency dispatchers for wasting their time. And you're going to complete a Citizens Police Academy course so you can learn the difference between real law enforcement and your imagination. The meeting ended with Margaret in tears and most of the neighborhood understanding exactly what had happened. Several residents came up to me afterward to apologize for doubting my conduct. But Margaret still wasn't done making mistakes. 2 weeks later, she filed a formal complaint with the county commissioners, alleging that I had used my position to intimidate a citizen and that I had acted outside my jurisdiction by handling a civil dispute. The complaint was forwarded to me for response, which was standard procedure. I was invited to present my case at the next commissioners' meeting. Margaret had unknowingly triggered a formal review of her own conduct. I arrived at the commissioners' meeting with a folder full of evidence. The original 911 recording, the incident reports, witness statements, and Margaret's own newsletter admitting she'd filed the complaint. Commissioner Williams opened the hearing by reading Margaret's complaint aloud. She alleged that I had used law enforcement authority to settle a personal dispute and had threatened arrest to silence legitimate HOA concerns. Sheriff Johnson, how do you respond to these allegations? I stood up and addressed the 3 commissioners. Commissioners, I responded to a felony being committed in my presence. The complainant falsely claimed law enforcement authority and filed a false police report. I offered her the choice of education or arrest. She chose education, then filed this complaint because she didn't like the education she received. I played the 911 recording for the commissioners. Margaret's voice filled the room. I'm calling as HOA president. We have special authority to request immediate police response. Commissioner Davis raised an eyebrow. Ms. Harrison, do you have special authority to request immediate police response? Margaret, who was sitting in the front row, shook her head. Then why did you claim to have such authority? I thought HOA presidents had. I didn't know. Commissioner Williams leaned forward. Ms. Harrison, are you aware that falsely claiming law enforcement authority is a felony? Margaret's face went pale. No, I didn't know that. Sheriff Johnson, Commissioner Davis continued, in your professional opinion, did Ms. Harrison's statements constitute impersonation of a law enforcement official? Yes, commissioners. She claimed special authority to command police response, which is a power reserved for law enforcement officials and certain government agencies. She also misrepresented the nature of the incident she was reporting, which constitutes filing a false police report. Commissioner Williams looked at Margaret. Ms. Harrison, Sheriff Johnson chose not to arrest you. Instead, he offered you an opportunity to learn from your mistake. Is that correct? Margaret nodded reluctantly. And instead of taking that opportunity, you chose to file this complaint alleging abuse of power? I felt intimidated. By being held accountable for breaking the law? The hearing continued for another 30 minutes, with the commissioners asking detailed questions about HOA authority, police procedures, and the difference between civil disputes and criminal violations. In the end, the commissioners not only dismissed Margaret's complaint but formally commended me for handling the situation with appropriate restraint. Commissioner Davis addressed Margaret directly. Ms. Harrison, you committed a felony in front of a law enforcement officer. Instead of arresting you, Sheriff Johnson offered you education. Instead of accepting that education, you've wasted county resources with a frivolous complaint. I strongly suggest you complete the Citizens Police Academy course Sheriff Johnson recommended and educate yourself about the legal limits of your authority. Margaret left the hearing thoroughly defeated, but the story still wasn't over. Within a week of the commissioners' meeting, I received resignation letters from Margaret and 2 other HOA board members. Margaret's letter was brief. Due to personal circumstances, I am resigning from my position as HOA president effective immediately. The special election to replace her was won by Tom Peterson, a retired teacher who believed in common-sense governance and treating neighbors with respect. One of Tom's first acts as HOA president was to send a letter to all residents clarifying that HOA authority was limited to civil matters and that no HOA official had any special relationship with law enforcement. The letter included a section about appropriate channels for noise complaints, proper procedures for contacting law enforcement, and a reminder that filing false police reports was a crime. Margaret's house went up for sale 3 months later. She moved to a different county, presumably to start fresh somewhere that didn't know about her brief career as a fake law enforcement official. The new owners of her house, the Johnson family, no relation, threw a housewarming party and invited the whole neighborhood. It was loud, fun, and completely within legal limits. Tom Peterson, our new HOA president, showed up with a cooler full of beer and a sound meter to make sure we stayed under 65 decibels. "Just kidding about the sound meter," he said, pulling out a Bluetooth speaker. "But I did bring music." The transformation of our neighborhood was remarkable. Without Margaret's constant drama and fake authority, we actually became a community. People started talking to each other, organizing events, and solving problems together instead of filing complaints. Property values increased as word spread that Oakwood Heights had reasonable HOA governance and wasn't ruled by a power-hungry Karen. 6 months after Margaret's departure, I was elected to serve a second term as county sheriff with the highest margin of victory in county history. Apparently, voters appreciated having a sheriff who understood the difference between real authority and imaginary authority. My daughter, now 17, still jokes about her legendary birthday party, the one that ended with the sheriff arresting the HOA president's ego. The Citizens Police Academy course that I'd recommended for Margaret? We started offering it monthly, and it became one of the most popular community education programs in the county. Turns out, lots of people wanted to learn about the difference between real law enforcement and neighborhood drama. I still grill burgers in my backyard every weekend. The music is still at reasonable levels, the gatherings are still legal, and nobody calls the police. But every now and then, when a new neighbor moves in and starts acting like they might be the next Margaret, the story gets retold. It's become neighborhood legend, the time our HOA president called fake cops on the real sheriff. The moral of the story is simple. Titles don't give you authority over other people's lives. Real authority comes with real responsibility, real training, and real consequences. Margaret learned that the hard way. If you're dealing with an HOA Karen who thinks her title makes her a cop, remember this. Document everything, know your rights, and never let anyone intimidate you with fake authority. And if you happen to be a law enforcement officer dealing with neighborhood drama, remember that sometimes the best way to serve and protect is to educate people about the difference between real power and imaginary power. Margaret called fake cops on my party, not knowing I was the real sheriff. She learned that day that there's a big difference between having a title and having authority. Some people never learn until they meet someone who actually knows what they're talking about.